Abandonment Issues. I've always known I was adopted. My mum and dad never made a secret of that. I called them Mum and Dad. My adopted ones, that is. They were the ones who wanted me. The ones who brought me up, put the time in and the love. They deserve that title. They gave me everything. I never met my biological mother or father. I never knew what happened to them, or why they gave me up. My mum always told me that they were really young when I was born, that they weren't married, and that it was different in those days. Back then, you just didn't have a child out of wedlock. As an adult, at times, I'd look back thinking how lucky I had been. In my darker moments, I pondered how easily I could have ended up in an orphanage or the abortion bucket. I've always been silently grateful to my birth mother for her courage in carrying me, instead of taking that easy way out. My therapist says I harbour deep resentment for her, and that this first separation tore open a wound that has never healed. She says I have abandonment issues, that they are rooted in the fact that my first and closest relationship was ended so abruptly, so inexplicably, that, as an infant, I had no way to understand anything but the loss itself, no way to cope, and part of me just shut it out. It's why I always fuck up my relationships with women. Somewhere deep down, I fail to connect. I don't allow myself to connect, because I'm so afraid that that connection will be broken. It's a twisted sort of self-preservation. The irony is that this very fear of rejection, of intimacy, has led to a life of broken connections. I guess I am a bit of a loner, really. Guess I always have been. I've got friends, but I don't see them all that much these days. They're all busy with families and careers. I've had girlfriends too, over the years, and a wife, and kids. But that all went wrong, or rather, I ruined it. I don't see them all that much either. Even as a kid, I'd always been fascinated by abandoned places. Perhaps because, on some level, I identified with them somehow. Old ruined churches and houses had always piqued my interest, set me thinking, wondering what their story had been, who had occupied them, and what had happened to lead to their dereliction. When my last relationship ended badly, this fascination turned to action, and in my desperation I drifted, spending my days hunting out whatever abandoned places I could find, and entering to explore them firsthand. There was something compelling about this communion with their poignant, melancholic emptiness that captivated my spirit. It became an obsession. As the months went by, I exhausted the supply of local derelicts and began to look further afield, at times travelling for hours to reach a particularly compelling ruined church or abandoned asylum that I'd uncovered in my research on the internet. I hadn't known what I'd been looking for all those long months. Picking my way through shadowy, deserted ruins by torchlight had been cathartic, yet somehow ultimately aimless until tonight. The hospital was located at the end of a disused road and had proven difficult to find, hemmed in as it was by wild hedgerows. I parked the car near the gates. They'd been chained and padlocked, of course, but that had never stopped me before, and it wouldn't stop me now. I scaled the ironwork easily, rust flaking off in chunks in my hands, staining them a dirty red, the colour and consistency of dried blood. It had been a long drive back to my hometown, the town I'd left 20 years before, and the sun was dipping below the shoulder of the west wing of the hospital building as I dropped from the top of the gate onto the cracked asphalt. Finding the main entrance locked up tight with padlock and chain, I explored the perimeter of the building, forcing a path through the dank undergrowth, in search of a means of ingress. There was always a way in. Eventually, I found it, an open window at the back of the east wing of the sprawling structure. It took but a moment to clamber up from ground level and through the open sash window into the cool darkness within. Switching on my flashlight, I surveyed the room, its pale beam illuminating a mess of damp papers and rotten, mildewed furniture, eerily animated by the shifting shadows cast by my light. The floor was slick underfoot, and rot patterned the walls and ceiling like blotches on the skin of a drowned corpse. The solitary door hung ajar on a single hinge. It groaned as I exited the room, the sudden sound breaching the silence, like a cry of anguish echoing in the hollow vastness of the decaying derelict. Drawn on by my own curiosity, by some prophetic magnetism, I made my way deeper into the maze of corridors, my footsteps echoing through forgotten halls that had once bustled with activity, with the age-old fight for survival, that ardent struggle for life against the inevitability of death. This place had formed an austere backdrop to the drama and tragedy of those bygone days. Countless stories had played out here, in this sprawling nexus of uncertainty, in this convergence of helpless hope and despair. As I wandered the empty halls, abandoned to dust and shadow, I could almost hear their voices, cries of pain and grief that had fallen silent decades before, cast adrift in a sea of time, were resuscitated in the darkest depths of my psyche. It felt as though a lingering imprint of tension was harboured in the very fabric of the place. It was a visceral thing. I could sense it via some ill-defined receptivity that operates beyond the remit of the scientifically accredited senses. A frisson of emotion akin to fear overtook me, and yet it seemed oddly blended with an unsettling sense of rapport and of reconciliation. At length, I mounted a broad staircase that led up to the second floor, treading stone steps littered with a dusty regolith of crumbling plaster. The great window illuminating the atrium was curtained with great drooping webs whose diaphanous folds were thickly laden with dust. This place had been long abandoned, even by the spiders. Several of its panes had been broken, doubtless the work of local children who, the world over, regard such abandoned places with disdain and suspicion. Their seemingly wanton acts of vandalism, in truth a manifestation of entropy, driven by that innate instinct of the young to hasten the demise of such things. At the head of the stairs I turned left. Some inexorable component of intuition led me onward. I followed the corridor, my footsteps echoing, hollow and desolate in the empty halls. I made my way past several dingy offices before I came to a set of double doors, beyond which lay the yawning expanse of a communal ward. A faded plaque on the wall designated it Postnatal Maternity Ward 2G. Gathering my nerves against I knew not what, I thrust the double doors open and tentatively crossed the threshold, peering into the gloom, finding, as expected, a string of rusted metal bedsteads lining the walls at either hand, with a vacant passage running between them, dividing the room. Thin rays of dying sunlight dissected the space, bleeding through tattered incisions in the Venetian blinds that sheathed the windows. Dust motes hung in those rays, like tiny planets in the vast void of space, drifting in eternal quietude. Time seemed to slow, and a deeper, solemn silence descended, auguring in some half-glimpsed esoteric paradigm shift, as though the building itself had, in some inexplicable way, become aware of my presence. At the farther end of the room was another set of double doors. I found myself drawn toward them, almost against my will. I moved automatically, the higher functions of my mind having become partially detached somehow from the physical. I was merely an observer now, lacking the will or inclination to control my actions. I watched impassively as one tremulous hand reached out to twist the door handle. Beyond the threshold, all was in darkness. In a trance-like state, I surveyed the room by flashlight, revealing in its dancing disk of light an assortment of neglected medical equipment that identified it as an operating theatre. I'd been here before. I knew that now. Here, in this very location, many years before. Though I had no actual memory of it, somehow I knew it as fact, and that knowledge sent a shiver through me, my skin crawling beneath my shirt at the implications of that flat realization. A gurney, complete with stirrups and restraining belts, dominated the centre of the room. A large, overhead lighting array loomed above it, sagging low on its corroded supporting arm. My flashlight flickered for a moment as its light played over that structure. Then abruptly, the battery died, leaving me in stark blackness. As I blinked there in the dark, fumbling with the flashlight, my eyes straining to adjust to that impenetrable gloom, a coldness clutched at me out of the void. I shivered violently, a sudden thrill of alarm shooting through me. That childlike fear of the dark flooding over me out of the past to overwhelm me. I was a child again, an infant, lost and alone in the night, with all a child's irrational fears, naive to the world, yet convinced of its imminent dangers. Gradually, the blackness was pushed back, and a faint glow waxed before my eyes. For a moment, I wondered if they were adjusting to the dark. But that wasn't it. Steadily, the glow intensified, taking shape above the gurney, an amorphous, glimmering mass that grew brighter by the second as I watched it, dumbfounded. By degrees, that glow took shape, finally coalescing into a shimmering human form. She was painfully thin, her stringy hair floating about her, wafting and lifting as though animated by a gentle yet sustained breeze. I was transfixed, my breath caught in my throat, eyes wide and staring. Slowly she turned to regard me, raising her eyes from the gaping wound in her belly, her eyes glistening with an existential sorrow. I felt a tear ribbon my cheek, then another. The recognition was not merely visual. It was lineal. It was elemental. My tears were not prompted by fear, nor were they tears only of sorrow, though that was part of it. They were also tears of love. As if from some disembodied distance, I heard my own voice. In a cracked whisper, I uttered a single word, and that single word was both statement and question.
Mother.